Welcome back. I promise no more April Fool's jokes. Our lovely conference is off to, at least based on the panels I've attended, as well as Kathleen Canning's talk so far, we're off to a terrific start. I'm very excited. It's very clear that we, in fact, have the makings of an exciting book of essays on bodies and citizenship. I want to alert you, in your packet is the call for papers for paper proposals for next year. The conference is going to be held basically the same weekend, but I think April 1st jumps to a Sunday, so you can be safe with my pranks. I do want to urge you to take a look, especially those people who I see dealing with issues of education might want to think seriously about joining us again next year. I'm once again welcome you, and I'm going to turn the podium over to Ellen Barton, the chair of our Department of English. For those of you who are going to dinner at Traffic Jam afterwards, I think we're going to reassemble in McGregor Center. We will give you rides down there. Anyone who would like to go to Traffic Jam and has not yet signed up, please speak with me, or maybe even better with Anne Marie, who actually knows what's going on, and you'll be welcome to join us. That shouldn't be a problem. Thank you, and very excited about Sue Wells' talk, and I know you will too.
Thank you, Mark. When I arrived at the Wayne State University English Department in 1985, I was told in regretful tones that I was occupying Sue Wells's line. I was also told that I was going to teach Sue Wells's seminar. I've never truly measured up. Somehow or another that first term, I ended up with the second half of Sue's syllabus for that seminar, which was my first imperfect and incomplete understanding of her as a teacher and a researcher. She read in disciplines I'd never heard of, and she brought them together as a master blend for composition theory. I think our first acquaintance was my request for the rest of her syllabus, which I followed slavishly. I became friends with Sue over the years at composition conferences, where she was working on her wonderfully titled book, Sweet Reason, a book that we still place on our graduate students' reading lists. Early in my career at these conferences, Sue generously encouraged me as I tried to figure out how to conduct research in the field of composition as a linguist, not an easy task, either the research task or the mentoring tasks. Later in my career, we became conference roommates, where she continued to encourage me in my work. And she has provided this kind of mentorship to many, graduate students, her own and others, junior professors at Temple, Wayne State, and elsewhere, and many, many colleagues in composition rhetoric and other fields, including critical theory, early modern studies, science studies, and the history and rhetoric of medicine. Sue's intellectual footprint is both broad and deep. She has the highest standards, and she is one of my favorite audience figures, the scholar you write to, revise to, and finally send to, only to receive a detailed and thoughtful response that starts the cycle all over again. Everyone should have such an academic figure and friend. Sue and I became research colleagues as our work moved both of us into the discourse of medicine, she in history and theory, me in discourse analysis, both of us in medical rhetoric. Sue's work in the history and rhetoric of medicine is brilliant and properly influential. Her two books, Out of the Dead House, 19th Century Women Physicians and the Writing of Medicine, and Our Bodies, Ourselves, and the Work of Writing, are models of research and writing. Recently, Sue and I worked closely together as co-leaders of two workshops in medical rhetoric at the Rhetoric Society of America's Summer Institutes in 2007 and 2009. We took what we called the white glove, white coat approach. Sue working from the perspective of the white-gloved scholar in the archive, me working from the perspective of the white-coated observer in the clinic. What fueled our work was, and this will sound corny, but it is true, what fueled our work was joy. I have never known a colleague who takes such an infectious joy in research. Sue responds to research with delight, amazement, appreciation, and sometimes critical frustration, all in the course of one conversation. She constantly reminds me that we have the best jobs in the world. We do research. I'm proud to occupy her line.
I want to thank Ellen for that incredibly moving introduction. It has been really a pleasure and a privilege to work with you over these years. And I also want to thank the organizers of this conference for the care and thought that they've put into putting together this program and designing it, and for making the arrangements. So thank you to Mark, and thanks also to Anne-Marie. I'm going to talk today, my talk today is entitled Genres of Citizenship, Power Structure Research in the 1960s and 70s. And it has a number of parts. Partly it's a sort of discussion of what it might mean to think about genres, how people in various disciplines understand genres. Then I sort of investigate the surprisingly transparent history of a very small genre, the Power Structure Research Report, with a lot of emphasis on the text of our bodies ourselves, which isn't exactly a power structure research report, but which I place within that context. And then I want to talk some about the significance that this might have for people who are studying citizenship. My discipline is rhetoric, and particularly the study of gendered rhetorics of science and medicine. And so I'm approaching the topic of this conference, the topic of citizenship, as kind of a friendly outsider. And I'm very grateful for people for their interest in what I might say about it. This is a wonderful chance for me to learn from this active and committed group of scholars of citizenship, and I hope my remarks will be useful to you. I'm going to start by talking about 3 ways of thinking about genre. For rhetoricians, the connections between genre and citizenship were clearly established by Aristotle in the Rhetoric, which defined 3 kinds or genres of speech events. Aristotle said that you could talk about things that happened in the past, and your audience has to make a decision about what happened in the past, and that's a forensic speech. Or you could talk about things that might happen in the future, and your audience has to make a decision about what to do about the stuff that's going to happen in the future, and that's a deliberative speech, or something he calls it a speech in council. Or sometimes you need to talk in a ceremonial setting, and there's no decision at all to be made. The usual example for this is the funeral oration, but you need to sort of seal the membership of the audience in that event. The rhetorical genres that Aristotle named were determined by temporal relations among speaker, audience, and exigency, a very elemental framework of civic engagement. From the beginning, these genres were associated with citizenship and the spaces where it was expressed: the court, the council chamber, the festivals of the city. And that's one way to think about genre. In literary history, there's another way of thinking about genre, and literary genres are quite different. They're things that are recognizable, like epics, lyrics, novels. And the genre theory in literature emerged in a different process. Identification of various kinds of texts on the basis of formal features, emotional effects, characteristic themes, or all 3 of these criteria. Literary criticism begins as a critical discourse about genres, their history, and their parameters, originating again with Aristotle in the Poetics this time. The discipline of discourse analysis offers us yet a 3rd way of thinking about genre. For discourse analysis, genre analysis is a tool for understanding how particular speech genres shape identities, coordinate actions, and negotiate disagreements. And I've learned a huge amount from Ellen's work in this area. I want to show how using these three approaches to understand the formal qualities of texts or the connection between texts and civic practices could be useful to scholars from multiple disciplines. Attending to genre can show us how texts support civic action, how they frame and construct bodies that are invested with agency. Attending to political exigency to which the text responds can help us understand formal features of texts that might seem contingent or unmotivated. Okay, and that's the initial, very short, this is what genre analysis is piece. And now I want to talk about power structure research. The Power Structure Research Report has a really short history, beginning in 1964, when writing power structure research reports is included in the curriculum of the Mississippi Freedom Schools. These schools were summer programs that trained students to work in voter registration and other civil rights campaigns. They taught nonviolence, law, music, and social studies. And, whoops. This is the pictorial highlight of the slideshow. It's a gorgeous picture. And this is a picture of two high school students, although they look younger, who are, as you see, producing written text using a typewriter, because what else would they use? The production of small documents that circulated locally, it was one of the things that you did in Freedom Schools. This generally happened as part of the civics curriculum, and civics was the central object of study in the Freedom Schools. And you can find this curriculum online in the SNCC papers. It's really an exemplary thing to look at. Students would learn civics by doing power structure research, which was the identification of the individuals who held political and economic power in an area and of their connections. Jack Minnis, an important activist in the Freedom Schools, produced a model case study entitled How Mississippi Power Works that illustrated the role of Northern corporations in maintaining Mississippi's elite and traced the effectiveness of Northern sympathy demonstrations against those corporations. In the Freedom Schools, the students, who were young people of high school age, were guided by teachers who were often volunteer college students in producing their own local power structure research reports. These reports had several functions. First of all, they said in print what everyone already knew. The sort of telling of secrets is one of the central speech acts of the power structure report. The way that Jack Minnis phrased it in his textbook, it was something like, tell who the big men in your town are. The big men in your town, totally vernacular formulation. They demonstrated explicitly the connections between political institutions and economic power, following ties of joint ownership, church membership, or marriage, to show how networks of power were distributed and interlaced. And they offered a dramatic practice of knowledge to those who wrote them, young people profoundly excluded from basic rights of political and legal citizenship, working under constant threats of violence. From Freedom Summer, the Power Structure Research Report begins to travel to other sections of an expanding and diversifying movement. Members of Students for a Democratic Society who had worked in Freedom Summer quickly adapted the framework of power structure reports to new issues. One veteran of Freedom Summer produced a pamphlet for SDS detailing the connections between the sugar industry and a coup in the Dominican Republic. And that was a sort of clear connection between something very everyday. Everyone uses sugar, especially in the early 60s, and an international event. The US intervenes in the Dominican Republic. Other Freedom Summer volunteers joined organizations of radical scholars, such as the Africa Research Council and the North American Congress on Latin America, and adapted the practices of power structure research to make connections between their own academic departments, military research, and corporate international policy. Fred Goff, for example, of the North American Congress on Latin America, which I'll refer to as NACLA, had been inspired by the SDS pamphlet on the sugar industry, and he wanted to replicate that research. How can we do that? He got his chance when students occupied Columbia University in 1968, protesting the construction of a gym and the university's relationship with defense contractors. And this is a quote from Goff. During the occupation of Columbia University in 1968, we virtually closed down for a few days. NACLA people spent most of their time up there talking to people in the buildings and trying to figure out a more immediate way we could use our research ability. Out of that came the pamphlet, Who Rules Columbia? That pamphlet sold 1,000 copies the first day. And here's a reprint of the pamphlet. It's not going to go all haptic on me. Okay. It sort of raises interesting issues of authenticity. This is the original 1968 strike edition, but obviously it isn't, because the original 1968 strike edition didn't say it was the original 1968 strike edition. But this is a version of the pamphlet held in the archives at the University of Texas at Austin, which has a really large online collection of interesting materials from the 60s. This pamphlet was modeled on the power structure research reports that people had encountered through the civil rights movement and early parts of the student movement, and also William Domhoff's 1967 book called Who Rules America, which was widely assigned to beginning political science and sociology courses. The NACLA pamphlet was quickly adapted and disseminated. In style, format, and production, it set the tone for other power structure research pamphlets. And those pamphlets generally looked a lot like this pamphlet. They were printed very quickly on newsprint. They were letter size, stapled into pamphlets. Who Rules Columbia made liberal use of press-on borders and headlines, which were sort of pre-digital means of making straight lines in widely reproduced documents, which I can describe to you. It's a little like describing ironing. It was a manual skill we developed, or typing. No more digressions. It did not write justified columns, and it offered readers lots and lots of text. The most striking graphic element in this text and in others like it was the power structure chart, which adapted the conventions of the corporate organizational chart to demonstrate conflicts of interest, unacknowledged ties, and unsavory connections. And this is one of several power structure charts in Who Rules Columbia. And it has to do with the relations concerning real estate holdings in Morningside Heights. And as you see, it looks exactly like a lines of reporting chart, which you probably have at your own workplace. And it's intended to show interlocking relationships between members of the university who are assumed to be beyond commercial entanglements and important real estate interests in the neighborhood. Student leftists produced their own versions of this brochure at other schools, and other activists in other kinds of campaigns adapted it to their political work. No fewer than 16 book-length studies in this genre were published between 1967 and 1975, including Who Rules Israel?, Who Rules the Police?, which was an intervention into the Civilian Review Board controversy, and my favorite, Who Rules the APA?, a study of the backgrounds of the leaders of the American Psychological Association. And beside these book-length studies, there were countless leaflets, four-sided brochures, adaptations, and sort of light versions of the Power Structure Report. Now we're going to, in a minute, follow the trail of this genre from a sort of generalized student movement to Cambridge, but I want to make some initial observations about it. From the beginning, the power structure report was a vernacular genre with stylistic features that called attention to its amateur production, but it was also informed by the conventions of social science research. In format, the power structure research report mediated between the psychedelic layout of the underground paper and the staid conventions of an academic journal. Texts were normally published as pamphlets with rivers of words set in unjustified columns. And I'll give you a small example, which you probably won't be able to read, but it will show you how this was set up. This is, again, from Who Rules Columbia. And I'm going to turn around so that I can see what you see. No, I'm not going to do that because you won't be able to hear me. I'll do it this way. If you look at this, you see sort of very basic features of this text. This is produced by photo offset, which is a very cheap, very simple process that anyone could learn to do in an afternoon, and lots of people did learn to do it in an afternoon. You can do lots of things, and if you can type it or cut it and paste it, you can do it in photo offset. But one thing that typewriters didn't do very easily at this point was to justify both sides of the page. And so almost never do you see completely justified pages. What you're also seeing here is a vast kind of accumulation of detail. Density and copia of information is really a hallmark of this genre from the beginning. And there's no principle of selectivity. There's nothing that is so insignificant or removed from the current struggle that you want to leave it out, particularly in the book-length versions of this genre. The language is relatively informal, but you would also notice that there is documentation, parenthetical footnotes. I mean, how often do you see that in a political document? So that you have like a style of production that says anybody can do this, and then a style of textual organization that says this is a document by reliable, credible scholars, so pay attention to it. Very interesting sort of juxtaposition of two forms of authority. Let me see where I am. Okay. The power structure report sustained an exchange between popular movements and academic expertise. Jack Minnis was a well-trained researcher who understood his role as putting the tools of academic research at the service of the civil rights movement. Engagement in that movement offered young scholars a model for transposing the research skills they were learning in area studies into more activist contexts. The organizations of leftist scholars and groups such as NACLA and the New Africa Conference brought the critical perspective of power structure research projects to bear on academic disciplines and institutions. If we follow Nina Webner in seeing citizenship as the site at which contradictions are named and contested, one of the central genres of citizenship, and I'm proposing that we could think about citizenship having characteristic genres, one of the central genres of citizenship in the 1960s and 70s was surely the power structure report. As the student movement reached its peak of activity in the late 60s and early 70s, many more power structure reports were written in support of campus movements, and those reports take us to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the members of the group that would become the Boston Women's Health Book Collective were attending classes, tending babies, looking for work, moving from one place to another and sort of slowly coalescing within an emerging Boston women's movement. In 1969, Harvard students struck an opposition to the presence of ROTC on their campus. The Africa Research Group and the underground paper Old Mole, in response to this student strike, produced a power structure research report. And they weren't going to call it Who Rules Columbia because, you know, nobody rules Harvard, so they called it How Harvard Rules. I'm not making this up. And as one of the writers said, the pamphlet was produced in 8 days under great time constraints, as well as political and emotional pressure. And that exigency and compression is really an important part of this genre's sort of footprint. Like Who Rules Columbia and other power structure research reports, How Harvard Rules was a booklet, in this case 88 pages. It was letter-sized, it didn't write justify, and it was ornamented with a lovely calligraphied power structure chart, which I would show you if I could find a way to fit it into one slide. It's a fold-out, it covers a small card table. It's kind of demented, I'll have to tell you. At one point, you look at it and, like, pastor of St. Paul's Church sounds really sinister, you know, whoa. The book was reviewed by the Harvard Crimson, and they had some trouble figuring out what they were reading, and I'll quote from the review. What is most fascinating about the book, magazine, or whatever is the range of its analysis. Like, what is this? Is this a book? Well, is this a magazine? Is this a whatever? It kind of weirdly echoes with what Kathleen Canning said earlier about a similar or whatever as people try to sort through possibilities of citizenship. The Crimson readers, unable to place this new genre easily, were taken with the power structure chart. They loved it. They ate it up. And they were struck by the critique of the fine arts department. The pamphlet went through each department at Harvard and talked about what problems there were. They quoted from Who Rules, How Harvard Rules. The art historian at Harvard, for the most part, is working for and with the ruling class for those who have time to acquire their particular culture. Although the Crimson was put off by wooden writing, the writers had to admit that at one level it all hangs together, which could be the sort of central genre constraint that we're dealing with here, that masses of detail all show you one thing. How Harvard Rules also found imitators in its immediate neighborhood. How Harvard Rules Women was produced during and immediately after the same Harvard strike. It demonstrates the central familiar technical features of the power structure research pamphlet. Letter-sized newsprint, cover image, unjustified print, oceans of unbroken text. These reports both promised information with an attitude, as the full title of How Harvard Rules suggest, which was How Harvard Rules, being a total critique of Harvard University, including, new liberated documents, government research, the educational process exposed, strike posters, and a free power chart. Okay. Looking at a fuller range of power structure research reports, we can paint a fuller picture of the genre as it developed. If, as Gary Saul Morrison has written, Bakhtin directs us to find in each genre its own view of the world, power structure research suggests that the world is quite different than what we've thought, but knowable, and that knowing the social world is transformative. From the early Freedom School productions to the later Boston texts, power structure research combined official wisdom, nuggets of information garnered from a careful review of the published literature, and the personal experiences of ordinary people. These documents were grand tellings of secrets, irreverent and transformative, as in this quotation from the opening of How Harvard Rules Women. And I'll show you the cover while I read it. The relation of Harvard to its women is similar to that of the missionary to his heathen. And your feelings, if you're a woman who's made it to Harvard's, to America's loftiest and oldest bastion of intellect and the ruling class, are often similar to those of the heathen imported for cultural development to imperialist shores. A mixture of gratitude, awe, doubt that you're worth the honor, and sometimes, dimly or blazingly, resentment that you're considered inferior. Everyone around you, whether you're a student or an employee, everywhere around you, are subtle testimonies to your biological obtrusiveness. Those sober-suited gentlemen who, with scholarly purpose and carefully averted eyes, sidestep you in the shadowy corridors of the Widener stacks. Those men, younger and older, who, as you enter the Widener reading room, inspect your legs as you pass to your seat, or who, in Holyoke offices, inspect your legs as you pass to your desk. All of the masculine worthies on the conglomerate Harvard faculties, with their mild manners, their green book bags, their after-dinner sherry gentility, and their government affiliation, overwhelm you with the sense that your womanhood is never neutral, but always provocative, of intellectual opprobrium, of patronage, humorous or curt, of sexual appraisal, of sexual advance. These broad rhetorical aims of the Power Structure Research Report were supported by many stylistic and formal choices. Power Structure Research Reports were both indexical to their social locations and also invested with performative force. Like academic papers, they meticulously documented their sources. Their pages were dense with information. No detail was too peripheral to mention. Copia, the accumulation of information, grounded the authority of these writers and intensified the generic action of exposure. In adhering almost periodically to norms of academic publication, the writers of Power Structure Research Reports claimed an authority that was not based on impartiality. Research reports were also marked by sprinklings of colloquial language, jokes, cartoons, drawings, things you don't normally see in academic documents. An expression of the writers' desire to establish their own authority against that of received academic institutions, which they were also sort of emulating in their research norms. The published Power Structure Research Report was in many ways secondary to the creation of a group of activists who could produce such a document. These reports pushed at the boundaries of the book as an object. Remember the confusion of the crimson, is this a book or a pamphlet or whatever? The report suggests that the publication of research, sort of like producing music, could be something that groups of friends undertook together, a quick convivial movement from the typewriter to the printed page to distribution, rather than a solitary, multi-year, life-defining project. Not that any of us have ever been involved in those solitary, multi-year, life-defining projects. Writers considered these texts transgressive. They remind us of Adorno's observation that conventions and genres did not just stand in the service of society. Many, such as the topos of the maid turned master, were already a blunted form of rebellion. In the case of the Mississippi Freedom Schools, the rebellion was anything but blunted, since their organizers saw power structure research as a tactic for interrupting monolithic white supremacy. The Freedom School organizers said what the aim of their instruction was. They would, I'm quoting, stimulate latent talents and interests that had been submerged too long, causing high school youth in Mississippi to question, and question is all in caps. Power structure research could produce a useful document, but it would more pressingly produce writers who would question received ideology, who would have faith in their own ability to discern the structures that shape their world. Now, in the student movement, it's not at all transgressive to write papers. I mean, what do students do? But there was something that student movements could do that made their text transgressive, and that was to secure the liberated document. Typically, what happened was in the course of strike or building occupation, the relatively naive university administration would be keeping their documents not in hyper-secured, change your password every 6 months files, but just in filing cabinets. And when the university president was peremptorily ejected from his office, and it was always his, the filing cabinets could be gone through and stuff could be taken out. Now, usually that stuff was something like, we have defense contracts, we want to keep them. Or the faculty senate doesn't like ROTC, how can we deal with the faculty senate? It was more or less tautological. I mean, if you have ROTC, probably somebody has decided they want to keep it. If there's an objection from the faculty, the university administration probably is figuring out how to counter it. What was really transgressive was taking these documents, Xeroxing them, turning them in to offset printing plates, and then distributing something that had existed in 1 or 2 or 5 copies to the world at large, making completely public what was not exactly private, but what had been seen as proprietary. The conjuncture of these rhetorical, formal, and performative features constructs the power structure report as a particularly powerful speech act, an act of civic exposure. Power structure research reports often juxtapose the ideological self-presentation of an institution or practice with the details of its connection to less savory economic and social relations. So you would have a report that says, Mississippi pretends to be a democracy, but really it's ruled by a small group of rich people. Or Columbia pretends that its central purpose is education, but it's actually deeply enmeshed in real estate transactions and defense research. Or Harvard pretends to be a reserve of independent thought, but it actually serves the State Department and the defense industry. Now, that act of exposure would be transformed when its target was not a corporation or a university, but the conventionally sacred and private space of medical treatment, when the territory of invention was no longer the interlocking directorate, but the anatomy of the clitoris. Making these changes would be the work of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. And now I move to Our Bodies, Ourselves. Mid-century American medicine, with many exceptions, presented itself as the custodian of both scientific impartiality and compassionate care, while restricting access to and information about health, particularly for women, and it was therefore ripe for power structure research, but not in the normal way. In 1969, the group that would become the Boston Women's Health Book Collective set themselves the task of learning about their own bodies and sort of entering the knowledge stream of healthcare. And I can tell you more about that decision and how it came about if people are interested. These women raided medical libraries, at least one of which forbade access to any readers who were not physicians. And what's interesting was that in this way, they really enacted the generic constraint of power structure research to do transgression. Countway Library at Harvard was at the time only open to students in the School of Medicine and School of Allied Health. One of the members of this group was a medical student. She would sort of trade off her ID card, and people would just kind of flash it on the way in. Now, this was completely unnecessary. I mean, you could go to Boston University, a subway right away. The stacks are open. You walk into them off the street. You didn't have to show anything. But there was something about enacting the fact that this knowledge looked familiar that was extremely attractive to this group. More than one of the members of the collective has told me with great giggling 40 years later about sneaking into the library. What a bunch of rapscallions they were. They thought about their own experience of sexuality, of childbirth, and of health care, thereby fulfilling the generic constraint that power structure research be transgressive. They shared this information with increasingly angry and articulate women by teaching a course which was then called Women and Their Bodies, during the winter of 1969 and 70. And in response to requests from these participants, they published the notes for the course as a book, Women and Their Bodies. The printed text was a very close cousin of How Harvard Rules Women. And I'll show you how the two relate in the next few slides. Okay. Here we have the cover of How Harvard Rules Women. Notice that it's 75 cents. It's basically a cover image, which you could do very easily in photo offset with a kind of overstruck title. This is the front cover of the 1970 Women and Their Bodies. And you have very amateur production of the title. Notice that the price is exactly the same, 75 cents. There's a central cover image. It's set in rather than sort of covering the whole page. And we have actual writers, but they're not named writers. The writers of How Harvard Rules Women are named in the copyright bug, which costs me endless pains to get around. They were named as a group of women in the new university conference. I mean, who is that to hold a copyright? But this is a Boston Women's Health Collective, who would later be known as the Boston Women's Health Course Collective, and then the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. The title changes from Women and Their Bodies to Our Bodies, Ourselves, which is 4 words, and then finally Our Bodies, Ourselves. Okay, here is the table of contents of How Harvard Rules Women. It includes, as you see, chapters called Living with the Boy, Graduate Students' Wives, Working for the Man, Women Employees. The book is really remarkable in including the perspective of women workers at Harvard. It has the same sort of march through the faculties, which is a very common organizational trope of power structure report. Notice how it's set up. It's a calligraphied list, probably hand done, doesn't look like press-on to me. And you would do this because usually these books are produced like really fast by farming out the chapters to different people. And nobody looks at the whole book until it's all together in one place. Bring in your chapters to Mary Ellen's house on Monday. And everybody does, and then they look at them all, and they're typed, and then they handwrite in page numbers, and then produce the table of contents now that they know how many pages each part takes. There's a very similar format, structure, look to the table of contents for Women and Their Bodies. And this is my copy, so it's much less pristine. It's seen some wear. But there's the same structure of the sort of handwritten table of contents, sort of put together after the fact. The page numbers are handwritten in. And you can see a page of the text on this side. Again, columns are not justified. The typing is dense, dense, dense. At this point, it's not covering information. This is a sort of introduction to the course, how we came to be. Other parts of the text, there is no technical term in Latin too complicated or too recondite for these writers to include, because that was a way of demonstrating authority. So we can see a very close kind of visual format relationship of almost cousinship between these texts, and it's not really different. I mean, if you'd gone from Who Rules Columbia to our Women and Their Bodies, you would see similar kinds of affinities. There are many generic cues connecting Our Bodies, Ourselves to contemporary performances of power structure research. But members of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective did not at all identify with that genre. As I would sort of show them, you know, sort of a copy of How Harvard Rules Women and say, do you remember this? After I learned not to ask, did this influence you? Which I had very crude interviewing techniques at the beginning of this project. And they would say, yeah, I sort of remember that. They tended to remember more How Harvard Rules. None of them felt that they were writing a book like this. It had no conscious influence on them, even though there are clear affinities. There's a family resemblance between these texts. And sometimes they would say something like, power structure, this kind of book is about institutions, and we were writing about health, which is one of the ways that people generally, in vernacular situations, distinguish genres. You know, a tragedy is about death, and a comedy is about something funny. And they were making the same kind of genre kind of identifications. Retrospectively, we can see a relationship between Our Bodies, Ourselves and power structure research reports. That connection was not salient to the book's initial writers or readers. Now, this kind of unconscious genre affiliation is something that literary scholars are really familiar with. It's really not uncommon for somebody to write about a literary text. It looks like it's this, or it presents itself as this, but it's really that. It presents itself as a melodrama, but really it's a novel of manners. It looks like it's science fiction, but it's really utopia. But in rhetorical genre theory, this is like a crazy thing to argue, because rhetorical performances are all about intentionality. And how could you produce something that you didn't intend to produce, especially on the level of form? It's like an absurdity, which doesn't mean we won't talk a whole lot more about it, which I'm going to do right now. Our bodies ourselves colonize the genre forms that power structure research had developed, including its stylistic preference for detail and copia, its do-it-yourself style, and its delight in discovering and telling secrets. Most of all, Our Bodies Ourselves asserts a belief in the transformative power of knowledge characteristic of power structure research. Again and again in the early editions, readers are urged to form their own women's health groups, to talk about their experiences with other women, to replicate the collective's politicization, to just look at their own bodies. Talking about the body, like liberating presidential memos, is understood as a transgressive act of knowledge that opens up a new location for political struggle, the doctor's consulting room, which was also in 1970 a central site for the delivery of medical care. Members of the collective wanted some things that were very simple. They wanted respectful treatment from their doctors. They wanted other ambitious things. They wanted to transform American medicine. One of the strangest moments in the interviews I did with these women was one woman said, yeah, we wanted to transform American medicine, and we sort of did. And that sort of strange relationship of irony, but also a claim, assertion, is very characteristic of this group. They saw these changes as effected in and supported by conversation. Women would talk to each other, learn enough basic health information to be able to make sense of their medical treatment, and be supported in understanding what worked and what didn't work for them. Women managed their medical care in conversations with their doctors. That's how it happened in 1970. And their talks with each other helped them to carry out these conversations successfully. They also generated self-help groups, women's clinics, and support groups. The doctor-patient dyad was seen as a central node in the system of medical care, the place where broad structures of power were articulated for women. The Boston Women's Health Book Collective wanted to make that dyad more symmetrical and less exclusive. Many, many passages in Our Bodies Ourselves instruct readers in carrying out confrontations that would redistribute power in that relationship. In the 1970 Anatomy and Physiology chapter, for example, once we have some basic information about how our bodies work, by talking and learning together and spreading the correct information, we need not be at the total mercy of men. Going in small groups together to support each other is incredibly helpful to us and works wonders of humility on the minds of many doctors. By bringing the relationship between patient and physician into the public sphere, Our Bodies Ourselves negotiated a new definition of what counted as political. The deeply personal and legally confidential conversation of the consulting room was opened out and shown to enact the needs of a medicine that, while not yet corporate, certainly had become industrial. Individual decisions to use the birth control pill or not to use it were located within a web of power relationships. The books referenced the birth control pill's early trial use in Puerto Rico, the influence of pharma on the decisions of individual physicians, and the pressing question of whether a woman's reproductive capacities were in fact hers to control. And it's important to remember that in 1970, when the very first edition of Our Bodies Ourselves was published, it was illegal in the state of Massachusetts, I mean, not just to have an abortion, it was illegal everywhere, but to prescribe birth control pills to an unmarried woman. I mean, if you sort of knew a sympathetic doctor, you could go to the doctor and sort of work out some deal that they weren't being used for birth control, but for some other purpose. Or that you were actually engaged and going to get married next month, so please, I need to go on to them. But these were very, very uncertain strategies, and the sort of development of a body of information about who would prescribe birth controls to unmarried women was very undependable and very fluctuating. So it was not a world that was at all open to the idea that women had a right to control their health care. Our Bodies, Our Cells is an insistent reminder of the truth of Ruth Lister's assertion that the struggle to control the meaning and positioning of the divide between public and private is central to the project of engendering citizenship. And then Lister goes on to say something which I don't know is true or not, you'll have to tell me, and that insight is usually still ignored or discounted by many male citizenship theorists. Maybe, maybe not. For some theorists, opening the conditions of women's health care, especially reproductive health care, to political analysis was an unambiguous step forward. For others, like Ruth Miller, who has characterized the division between public and private as fantasy, renegotiating these boundaries might be seen as further opening the door to Agamben's biopolitical regulation of embodied life, an irreversible and not necessarily positive element of modernity. Whether we see the emergence of political discourse about individual women's experiences of embodiment in the 60s and 70s as a step away from the virtually feudal medical power of physicians in the 1950s, or as a step toward the wholesale regulation of biological life, it is clear that the Boston Women's Health Book Collective offered women a way of entering a political consequential conversation from which they had been excluded. Without this book, women's voices would not have been heard so clearly in a process of changing the delivery of medical care and its political positioning within all of the apparatus of citizenship. The Boston Women's Health Book Collective imagined a form of political action that did not move through the canonical arc of escalating direct action, from leafleting to picketing to sit-ins to building occupation. Instead, they saw the struggle for woman-centered health care playing out as women insisted on reading their medical records, or controlling the conditions under which they gave birth, or on getting more information about birth control pills. And in the papers of the sort of umbrella organization of the Boston left, which the Boston women's movement, which was called Bread and Roses, there's controversy about this. Some people sort of criticize the women of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective not being sufficiently political and advanced a different kind of program around healthcare reform that's centered on the public hospitals. And this sort of led women who are part of the collective to say, no, that isn't how we want to go. A position paper that includes a sort of interesting statement, no one was ever radicalized by a leaflet. And you wouldn't really believe that if you saw how many leaflets were produced during this period. Somebody thought they did something. Okay, where are they? These actions would be the basis for collective forms of resistance as women shared their experiences and constructed a basis of trust, founded on an understanding of women's embodiment as a universal experience, which was their understanding, that embodiment is universal. In the words of one collective member, our bodies all looked different, but they all worked the same. We all had bodies. This knowledge would provide power to every woman on the planet. I was really struck by the collective's adherence to this universalism because there's nothing more common in contemporary feminist theory than the rejection of a notion of universal womanhood as necessarily marginalizing women from racial or sexual minorities and as establishing relatively privileged white Western women as the prototypes of that universal female. When I interviewed women from the collective, they knew about all of this. One of the sort of strange things about working in this process is that members of the collective would go to academic conferences, hear papers about themselves, and then incorporate the insights of that paper back into their work. So that I never wanted to say too much about what I was writing, or it would change what they were doing. It was very, very delicate and frustrating. But so they'd heard the whole debate within the women's movement in both its academic and political forms, and they were aware of it, and they didn't think it was crazy, but they just didn't need it. They saw it as something going on somewhere else that was not useful to them. Indeed, Kathy Davis, in her book, The Making of Our Bodies Ourselves, How Feminism Travels Across Borders, has convincingly demonstrated that the Boston Women's Health Book Collective formed densely collaborative relationships with feminists from disempowered global communities on the basis of a sense of universal female embodiment that was shared with those women. Members of this audience are familiar with similar discussions of the universal force of the term citizen, which can be seen either as a tool for exclusion or as Lister says, an invaluable strategic theoretical concept for the analysis of women's subordination and a potentially powerful political weapon in the struggle against it. How did the collective's adaptation of the Power Structure Research Report express their ideas about women, embodiment, and civic agency? Our Bodies Ourselves draws on the genre of the Power Structure Research Report, and it also torques and redirects the genre. The book is not a power structure research report, but in many ways, as you can see, it looks like one. And if you read it, it would read like one with its direct and colloquial language, its belief in the transformative power of knowledge, its preference for detail and copia, its delight in discovering and telling secrets. And its incitement, you go and write your own. In Charles Bazerman's discussion of genres as levers for operating the social machine, what a strange metaphor, he asserts that genres are typified actions, typified so that we all, to some extent, are aware of the form and force of these typified actions. Bazerman goes on to say that the genres we participate in are the levers which we must recognize, use, and construct close to type in order to act on the world. The Power Structure Research Report was a genre that was consciously propagated, but then so widely disseminated and adapted that the levers it afforded became simply tools, and their associations with a recognizable genre were forgotten. By the early 1970s, the genre was winding down. The Power Structure Research Reports continued to be produced through the early 70s, often in connection with a student strike or a community protest. But I have found no instances of vernacular publications in this genre about 1975, although people still continue to write essays of exposure, which later could become sort of paranoid. In the Power Structure Research Report, then, we have a compact genre with a floruit, which is a kind of fancy literary historical word for how long it lasted, from 1964 to 1975. These were texts that enacted a civic purpose. They were exigent in their timely response to the needs of a particular political struggle. Using Bazerman's term, we might ask what typified action they undertook. Earlier in this paper, I suggested that power structure research projects were valued for both the documents they produced and the styles of interaction they fostered. Researchers in speech genres have demonstrated how genre performance works at once to produce knowledge and to develop identities. For example, in medical settings, a genre such as presenting a case does two things. It communicates information about patient care, and it also cultivates the user's sense of how we do things, and that we could be we in this discipline, we at this hospital, we in this ward. It can be a very sort of granular sense of identity. Analogous concerns were very much alive for early power structure researchers. These writers certainly produced information. Jack Minnis was by all accounts an original, and someone should write a biography of Jack Minnis someday. He pored over the public record, searched out subtle connections, and wrote up his findings in documents that James Forman and Stokely Carmichael used to great rhetorical advantage. In the Freedom Schools, SNCC attempted to form identities through the act of producing knowledge. Later power structure reports also challenge readers to do their own research, to produce their own text. Writers of How Harvard Rules anticipated that their readers might be skeptical. I should apologize. Is there anyone from Harvard in the room? Might be skeptical of the fold-out power structure chart included in the text, and they commented, "By now, some eyes will be blinking in disbelief. Can this be true?" they will ask. "It appears so overdone. It smacks of a crude conspiracy theory of power." If we still haven't told you enough, don't despair. Pick up Who's Who, Social Register, and Moody's Manual, then make your own chart. It will do funny things to your head, too. Our Bodies Ourselves had a similar double function. It would provide women with information they needed, and it would confirm their trust in their own experience of embodiment and in the support of other women. In the first editions of Our Bodies Ourselves, writers assert their interest in organizing women rather than in becoming experts in health. In 1970, it was exciting to learn new facts about our bodies, but it was even more exciting to talk about how we felt about our bodies, how we felt about ourselves, how we could act together on our collective knowledge to change the healthcare system for women and for all people. We hope this will be true for you, too. But the collective's commitment to provide readers with health information was at odds with their commitment to fostering groups of women who could carry out their own research in an egalitarian, non-expert practice of knowledge. When Our Bodies Ourselves became a bestseller in 1973, the collective committed themselves to providing, as they put it, as much information on women's health between the covers of this book as we can. I mean, think about the mortgage you're taking on when you agree to provide as much information as can be bound into a book. Very, very difficult. They needed to keep up with the accelerating pace of medical research, and they developed networks of collaborators who could help them. But that sustained activity changed them from ordinary women working at their kitchen tables to experts of a new kind. Readers would write in and they'd ask for more information. Why don't you have anything about kidney disease? But nobody ever wrote in and said, your book is getting long and kind of boring and hard to find stuff in. And so it grew and got continually more comprehensive, more technical. The writers of Our Bodies Ourselves became experts against their will. As early as 1973, group members mourned, "We never talk anymore," or "We don't have real close conversations like we used to." Unlike Our Bodies Ourselves, most power structure research reports were one-off documents. These texts, produced at moments of political crisis, expressed a collective intellectual identity that hybridized professional research skills and vernacular experience. That hybrid identity was fragile. Some groups, such as NACLA and HealthPAC, developed a line of research that was supported by foundations and donors, and they became professionalized. Writers from any other groups scattered in many directions. Some resolved themselves into the increasingly commodified youth culture, writing for papers like The Old Mole and relating to the paper's countercultural base. Others, like many of the writers of Who Rules Harvard, continued to work as professional academics, coordinating their scholarship through the Africa Research Group. In all of these histories, the two purposes of power structure research as a genre were at odds. The more skilled a writer became at the task of exposure, the less exemplary and replicable was her work. Or to put it a different way, once you had written a power structure report, you were no longer the ideal writer of a power structure report. You really could only do one in the generically correct way. As I read in the literature of citizenship to prepare for this conference, I learned that some social scientists, including my fellow keynoter Kathleen Canning, speak of a linguistic turn, of the need to attend to the verbal realizations of social and political relationships. This turn, they wrote, has been exciting and valuable, since it suggests that a study of history and politics can include the work of language rather than seeing language as a transparent, immaterial conduit that delivers a reality to us in sanitized packages. I also learned that some writers see the linguistic turn giving way to a material turn. And I want to suggest that the category of genre, which mediates between textual forms and their material realization as books or pamphlets or whatever, can become useful at precisely this point. Rhetorical genre theory helps us to see texts as a way of organizing the interactions of writers and readers. Discourse-centered genre theory helps us to trace how texts organize action and form identities. Literary genre theory directs us to specific features of texts, their recurrence, history, and resonance with other texts. Perhaps genre can become a bridge between the study of texts and the study of other ways of organizing human actions. It would be good to see what news we can bring to each other as we travel that unlikely and beautiful arch. Thank you very much. And I hope there'll be some questions. Yes?
How did the power structures themselves receive these critiques? How did they,
With widespread attempts to reform. There were legal actions. Yes?
Can you reiterate the question, please?
Oh, the question was, how did the power structures who were being researched receive the critiques? And I'll give a more serious and less wiseacre answer. Around the Columbia and Harvard publications, there were criminal charges filed for the theft of documents. And those were prosecuted for a while, and some people did time on them, but often the charges were dropped. Sometimes there would be some sort of formal reply, which was usually pretty dismissive. This is an amateur, out-of-context attempt. That kind of critique tended to spur the desire to add more copia and more detail, which would show professionalization. There's a sort of, principle of accumulation that works really strangely in this genre. Often, the Power Structure Research Report was not particularly known by the upper reaches of university administrations, although they would circulate wildly among faculty who wanted to find out what was said about their departments, and so it would be ignored. So there's a range of responses, and none of them seems to have much effect on either the production, dissemination, or understanding of power structure research reports. Yes?
Can you say a little something about what you think more contemporary social media, what venue or genre, Facebook and anything else people can imagine, what's the contemporary power structure report thing?
Yeah. Well, I want to confine my answer to the field of health and health information, because I can't know all of it, And I have to tell you, it's not very encouraging. I mean, there is a huge amount of health information available in digital media, but exactly that conjunction between expert and reliable knowledge, self-education, and integration of personal experience is completely lacking. If you look at the digital media, you find very useful sites like WebMD, where you can get totally impersonal knowledge, delivered with the voice of authority, often no named writer. If there is a named writer, we have their picture, with a white coat. And then you have a lot of sites that offer experience and where patients communicate with each other in forms that move from message boards to much more sophisticated information sharing. There is information in those sites, but there tends not to be much of an attempt that I've seen, and maybe you know something that I don't, to sort of incorporate current medical research. And I think this has something to do with this sort of exponential growth in the complexity of medical knowledge that makes the task of mediating much, much harder. And also that social media give an exigency which makes the 8 days within which How Harvard Rules was produced look luxurious, you know? Like, what, you're going to take 8 days to get at this? So I think it's an unsolved question. I mean, there is much, much more participation, but exactly that sort of really, really interesting genre path that this genre took, I don't see being followed right now. And I hope somebody will raise their hand and say, wait. Thank you.
Well, I was going to ask this question, and I think it fits into it. I mean, when I think about the genre, I immediately think of the womanly art of breastfeeding and La Leche League, and how it comes from, and that effort. I guess, is that really the same genre? Because I do think that today, when you look at pro-lactivist breastfeeding, I do think that the way that works online and then on digitally, it has a lot, as you were saying, and I'm thinking this is just like, well, not just like, but it's a similar, I guess, a more updated version of that. So I would counter that. I do think that with the breastfeeding, breastfeeding literature, and that interest in the women behind that, and the men, I do see some similarities there.
Well, I would agree with, luckily I had a student doing work in this area pretty recently, and in some ways I would agree with you, particularly around the issue of transgression and the sort of really interesting status of pictures of breastfeeding mothers and babies on the World Wide Web, where from time to time these are just declared obscene, or comment lines will be totally offensive and very strange, which it seems to me is a kind of manifestation of the movement toward transgression. Where I would not see the same relationship is around the use of expert information, which it seems to me is very uneven and not very critical within the pro-breastfeeding and pro-lactation communities. You know, I may be wrong about this, but the sort of review that the women in the Boston Women's Health Book Collective did on the literature around birth control pills, which was an extremely rigorous review, I haven't seen something like that in the pro-lactation literature.
I think that they do.
Okay.
I mean, we're kind of skirting around the issue because I have a very strong critique of the way that they ignore it, or they pick and choose. But I do think that they do. I mean, they've got their standard. I guess the reason why it's interesting to me is because it's pro-women, pro-breastfeeding, but it's very also at the same time very critical of dominant, the big pharma, or Nestle, or doctors themselves. So I think it's this kind of more contemporary version where, I mean, I've got Our Bodies, Ourselves Too, the 80th edition, but I think that what we're seeing today with breastfeeding is I haven't thought about it, but I do think that it's similar to that, but because it's politically more sensitive, it's not really left, it's not really right.
Right.
Anyway,
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that thought. Yes.
I was just going to add, it seems to me that it's a different form of expert knowledge.
Uh-huh.
It's not sort of institutionalized in the way medical school or medical research gets made with experimentation in a kind of controlled sense, but sort of the collective wisdom of women who have done this over time and their understanding of their mothers and their mothers' mothers.
Yeah.
So it seemed as if it sort of responded from a different, not really lesser, but just different form of expert authority.
Yeah, I would agree that the sort of collection and making available of sort of organized and, you know, made coherent body of experience of women with various aspects of embodiment, hugely, hugely important thing to do. I would also say that in 2011, placing that body of experience in some kind of relationship with an increasingly chemical and quantitative body of medical research, is something that has to be done. It is not at all easy, and I wish I had better ideas about how it could be done. But to abstain from that is to leave a lever, as Beserman would say, completely untended. And I don't think I think we might regret that. Yes?
How much of this was written towards with the knowledge of the audience that itself wanted to be transgressive by sharing in the work?
That is an excellent question. The collective was really, really good in its early years at including its audience as authors. You'll remember that Women and Their Bodies is basically the teaching notes from the course that they taught. And as they would teach women's health courses, you know, they would sort of start out with a little presentation, but almost immediately people would say, no, that's not what happened to me, or yeah, that happened to me, and let me tell you. And they would have stories to tell. The practice of the collective in the late 60s and early 70s was to go to these presentations, and they did hundreds of them in those early years. They have a record of their speaking engagements, and they are daunting. They would go to these engagements with index cards, and when someone told a remarkable story, they would hand them an index card and say, could you write that down for us? And then they would come back and put it into their file system, which, let me tell you, was like a really strange file system. It was also the case that in the early editions, the way that things like revision worked was that the collective members would go to a meeting of Bread and Roses and say, we're going to work on revision Tuesday night. Come by so-and-so's house and help. You would go by so-and-so's house. The chapters would be on a table. Someone would hand you one and say, could you look at this? Okay. It wasn't until 1973 when the collective signed the agreement with Simon & Schuster that they constituted themselves as a corporation, for one thing, and had to have named members and sort of limited themselves to the 14 original members, and took final control over the text. And that final control was at first exercised in relationship to the press. Their contract says, we have final control over every word that you publish. But it also was going to be exercised in relation to contributors, and that was negotiated in a very, very interesting set of debates with people who produced articles on fertility that they didn't like, or articles on birth control that seemed iffy. It had to be negotiated over and over again until about 1985 when it stabilized. Yes?
How did the people who were producing these pamphlets decide what to charge for them? I mean, were they making money off it, or were they just covering their costs, or what were they doing there?
The question was, how was price set? These pamphlets were generally printed, the Boston pamphlets, were printed by an organization called the New England Free Press, which was a mostly anarchist organization who tended to just cost it out as a sort of expenses plus, you know, expenses and enough to keep us in brown rice. And that was great for many reasons. It was terrible because when the pamphlet became really popular and was selling 250,000 copies, there was no way in all of New England that they could keep up with distribution. And so they were calling up the collective and saying, could you guys come over and collate and staple? And you know, that was not what they wanted to do, which was one of the main reasons that they went to a mainstream publisher. There were certain conventions, sort of conventional prices for these occasional publications. You would expect to pay somewhere between a nickel and a quarter for a small pamphlet, and somewhere between 75 cents and $1 for a bigger book. The price of Our Bodies, Ourselves went down from 1970, where it was 75 cents. After they sort of sold all of these, they said, wow, we've made back what we paid for the plates. We can sell it for 50 cents now. And they did, and sold a bunch more for 50 cents. So, I mean, we're not dealing with a huge variation here, but there was no particular attempt to make money. When the collective did make money, from the 1973 edition, which became a bestseller, At these long agonizing meetings, what should we do with this money? I mean, they're more agonizing than any meeting about like a really difficult problem. And somebody says, well, why don't we put it away and have a reserve fund? And they say, no, 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 no. That means participating in capitalism, because where would we put it? A bank? No, no way. So instead, they set up a grant program, and they gave they paid themselves, and they were always very serious and about paying themselves and anyone else who worked for them. But their profit was sort of given away in $5,000 grants to things like the Cambridge Women's Health Center and a birthing clinic in New Hampshire. And within 2 years, that money was exhausted, and they were laying each other off. So they've had to learn a lot about supporting themselves. They had to, as they said, we had to turn from a family business to a stable operation.